Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches a todas y a todos. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar in Debt with Human Rights, Realities and Challenges in the Current Debt Landscape.
Welcome to this webinar, In Depth with Human Rights, Realities and Challenges in the Current Debt Landscape. We do have translation English to Spanish, so you can select in the, below your screen, the option that you prefer.
We have translation, Spanish, English. Please select in the bottom of your screens the option that you prefer for this webinar. This webinar is co-organized by the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, APWLD, the African Women's Development and Communications Network, FEMNET, the House of Fiscal Wisdom,
and also co-organized by Latindat. My name is Patricia Miranda. I'm the Director of Global Advocacy in Latindat, and I'm going to be moderating this webinar. So again, welcome everybody to this webinar where we want to put back into the agenda the debt and human rights. Debt is a topic that becomes more of a priority in the global agenda. We have seen that this year and we continue to see it. And the thing is, a larger exposition to credit flows to which all of our countries are exposed to has not given a place to a net contribution towards development in the global south. In the contrary, it has facilitated the transfer of resources towards creditors. And as we have seen in Latin America, those are transfers, particularly after COVID, those are negative transfers in external flows from a region. In a crisis context that we're living right now, each country with their own characteristics, but there is a global crisis context where there's no mechanisms for the access of just external financing, meaning according to the conditions and conditionalities that this financing has. And that furthermore, there's no integrated system or comprehensive system of conflict resolution when a country is over in debt and or is close to a default. The states prefer to avoid measures that may prevent their access to the capital market, including structural reforms and austerity measures, even though that might compromise their capacity to ensure the exercise of human rights. The high level of payment of the debt in our public budgets is at historically high levels in the majority of the countries in the global south. The payment of the service of the debt, both externally and internally, currently is double the expenses in education, health, and social protections, with indirect effects in the perpetuation of the poverty cycles and economic dependency, harming the efforts to ensure human rights. The purpose of this webinar is to evaluate the current situation with a global view, but also with an emphasis from the South. And we have the regions of Latin America, Asia, and Africa that ultimately are the places we live in and where we feel the impacts of the debt in our rights. We're going to analyze what we have lost in the debate because it's not a new debate. This debate comes from decades ago. What have we lost currently in this crisis context relating to this debate regarding the connection of debt and human rights, and what are the challenges and opportunities, particularly after the fourth FFD4, considering that this is a Jubilee year, the Jubilee of the Debt, and other spaces and initiatives that we have moving forward where we can have a context of opportunity. And with no further ado, I'm going to present our panel. It's an honor to have such a high-level panel of specialists and experts, professionals of very high level, and also colleagues, very close colleagues, actually. So I'm going to start by introducing Tia Waris. She is the
Atia Waris, she is the UN independent expert on foreign debt, other international financial obligations, and human rights.
We also have Francisco Cantamoto. He's an associate researcher in ISS, as in CONICET Argentina, and he's also a consultant or advisor in LatinDat.
I'm also happy to introduce Misun Wu. She is the regional coordinator of the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, APWLD. And also very happy to have Memory Kachambwa. She is the executive director of the African Women's Development and Communication Network, FEMNET. So we are going to start with Atia. Atia, would you bring us what is the global overview of debt financing instruments and human rights? You have done several analyses in different countries in the global south. So what is your assessment? What is the current context now? And what are the key opportunities in global arenas? Atia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I'm, as always, delighted to work with such wonderful people across the world and looking forward to the conversation. So my presentation, what I want to speak about is the FFD being sort of a watershed moment in the world on the conversations around debt and tax and the challenges and opportunities that I see, but also the progress that has been made, because there has been some, and I will draw on some national examples, but also some global ones, and I will of course be mindful of time. I think if there's two main takeaways I took from the Financing for Development conversations that were in Spain this year, it's that I found two things missing. I found a conversation around human rights and the humanizing of the space missing. And with it, I found an absence of a conversation around women specifically. And so I think that there is a real challenge that we are facing in financial spaces in getting to understand why debt is taken on, why taxes are collected, why countries are engaging on conversations, for example, on monetary or currency protections or stability. And that is because this entire financial system is intended to help people, to build people, to develop economies, to grow economies, and to make sure that people have what they need on the table, as well as go beyond survival. And so this was the first thing that I found was missing. The second thing that I found was missing in the conversations was actually a realization as to where we have reached and where we're going to go and what we're going to do to get there. And for me, this really centered around the historical context and the absence of a conversation around peace. And the reason I say that is because there was very little conversation, especially in the main rooms, about the fact that there are so many wars and conflicts around the world right now. And what are these financial repercussions going to have, not only on countries in war and conflict, but also the ones who are not. But if I move from that, I noticed about three issues that I think have progressed. The first is that there is a clear decision to have a debtors club in the same way that there is a creditors club. So member states that owe money are going to be able to speak to each other. This is extremely important because what I have noticed over the past few years in observing IMF debt agreements is that countries that look the same or behave the same on the same schedules will have completely different interest rates, will have completely different conditions of repayment or all sorts of terms. And so it's very important that countries that are similar are treated similarly. And so this was the first thing that I think where there has been some progress, and I'm looking forward to seeing the Debtors Club emerging in time. The second is that there has been conversation around the setting up of a group of member states, I think, perhaps with specialists who can try and get some kind of solution going on the issue of a debt workout mechanism of some kind. Unfortunately, this hasn't led yet to debt forgiveness or cancellation. Little reference to debt moratoriums, but there is conversations around it. So there is some progress there. And at the Secretary General's office, there is a high-level panel on financing for development and the SDGs, and I think that they will be taking forward a lot of these conversations. So I think there there is progress. But if I move across to the issues that have some challenges, I saw three. One I've mentioned already, the issue of human rights and women. But the second two are issues around private creditors. Private creditors remain outside any form of regulation. We haven't seen attempts to put laws into place except in New York, where there is a bill pending in Parliament on investor responsibility for the effects of human rights abuses in developing countries, but that is a bill pending in Parliament. The second is credit rating agencies. The global conversations have not taken place to the extent to which we can now have global credit rating or any conversation on whether or not countries should even be rated and how they should be rated. So these three remain challenges, but I want to move to the opportunities because as much as it was a very difficult time in Spain, and a lot of people did leave there quite disheartened, I have to say I see a lot of hope at the regional levels and I see pockets of hope at some international levels. So, for example, at the international level, there is the treaty negotiation on a tax convention that is progressing. It's going to go through a lot of challenges. It's worth paying a lot of attention to it because there's going to be conversations around dispute resolution. And there's currently a deadlock as to whether the dispute resolution should be mandatory or not. In addition, most dispute resolution clauses end up using UK laws, and I think it's really important to make sure that we get to use the laws of our countries in deciding our disputes and that they remain as much as possible in the public domain so that members, citizens, residents of countries actually get to see what the problem is in a particular dispute on debt or taxes and also what the solutions are so that they are not asked to pay more taxes because a multinational or the member state is not honoring its obligations. That takes me to regional positive spots, which I noticed, and also opportunities. In Thailand, Asia has developed the Chiang Mai Initiative as a swift clearing point for transactions to bypass the US system. And in Africa, we have the same thing being set up in Kampala to, again, allow for African trade and Asian trade. These two are good steps forward, and they will open up conversations around rebalancing of power around the world and allow for a reduction in transaction costs, which I think is going to be very important. In addition, something to watch out for is the IMF. The IMF was tasked under the Pact of the Future to look into the reconstruction of the international financial architecture. However, to date, I have not seen a report from them, neither have I heard anything about progress in that part. And it's something we do need to keep an eye on to understand what that's going to look like. But I'd like to close with the whole conversation around debt cancellation and a Jubilee year. And the conversations have been that we must not step away from the conversations around debt cancellations, interest rate moratoriums, and cancellations, so that we make sure that this is something that we can continue to have on the table because it is very important. The world is in one of its worst ever economic crises. And so it is an opportunity to keep pushing through that conversation. I'd like to stop there because I'd like to hear what everyone else has to say as well. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. Patricia, back to you.
Thank you so much, Atiya, for this global overview, for reflecting what is missing in these very key processes that we have been working on for months. What are the challenges, but also the opportunities. And I would like also to take from what you mentioned about what would be also opportunities at regional levels. And that gives me the floor to invite our next speakers to have an overview from their southern regional perspectives and realities. So I would like to start with Francisco.
He's an associate researcher of COSET Argentina, and he's an advisor in LatinDat, so that he can tell us a little bit about. Francisco, you drafted a report recently about the debt and human rights in Latin America, a topic that has had a space for debate, for dialogue, for lots of influence in public policies and awareness raising as well. Several years ago, or decades ago, from the 80s, we might remember the last regional crisis that that we had. What is the current context? What were your main findings and your main recommendations? Thank you, Francisco. Well, I'm going to speak in Spanish, so you have time to select your language. First, I want to thank particularly Latin Dad for having invited me to participate not only in the panel, but in the elaboration of the report. So they gave me the opportunity to revisit several topics that compose this panel. I want to thank the rest of the organizations here that were convening us for this webinar, which is a higher level like an Aspire to. So I definitely thank you. So the report from Latindad kind of brings back to the table the link between that and human rights that goes through several levels in an effort to try to order the issue. It was proposing to think about, I was proposing to think about two moments that were alternating, not historically or sequentially, but from the point of view of logic. On the one side, the moment of taking the debt, in which there's at least two questions to ask in the region. One is if the region, the countries in the region, at the moment of taking this debt, they followed the legal steps for that, like to that debt to actually be legal, something that in many countries in the region is actually questioned. Not only in the historical debts of dictatorships in the 70s, but also in the most recent um, current history. And the second point is what the debt was used for, those resources that arrived through debt. Why is this relevant? Because if those were used for just spending, those that were benefited by that nonsense spending should respond for it. And I don't just mean the legal responsibility or accountability of the governments, but also the private actors that are benefited by these actions. The second moment, logic moment, not historical, is the moment of the payment of the debt, where we also see the link to human rights. If the first one had to do with the state of right in the most general sense, the use of public resources, the second one, the payment, we need to address two dimensions again to know how the payment of the debt is actually going to be displaced in other possible use of the taxing space, and also how it orients the productive generation of the country addressing the payment of the debt. And what do I mean? In terms of the taxing space, what we have seen is that in the region, there's been a growth up to a double in the proportion of resources that are allocated to the payment of the debt compared to the prior decade. This increase of resources allocated to the payment of the debt are withdrawn from other allocations targeting the coverage and ensuring human rights, such as health, education, social protections, amongst others, right? Now, this displacement of the taxing space is one of the elements to be considered on which many of the organizations participating in this webinar address in a very fluid manner, and they have constant reports about it. What I want to say is that orienting the economy towards the repayment of the debt, like the creditors are proposing, the region in Latin America has been biased towards a product specialization that does not address the needs of the population. And at this front, a process has been launched through which most of the countries is being supported in making work cheaper, um, affecting basic labor rights or the overexploitation of natural resources, affecting everything regarding the right to a healthy environment. Together, we are affecting the right to participate in the effects of development. In that sense, this special productive specialization in Latin America and the Caribbean has been dissociated from the needs and rights of the population living in this continent. And I believe it's relevant then in this game, particularly because it's a mechanism that seems to be reiterated once and again throughout time. As Patricia was saying when she was introducing me, the current moment that Latin America is going through right now CEPAL is calling it a second lost decade, referring to the first one, the 80s, as a period in which the region was not able to grow as a whole. It had more indexes of inflation, even though they had already paid the debt, the total debt or some debt. The total debt actually was increased, and this was done by affecting the destination of taxing resources towards the protection of rights. Effects that still affect us today due to the increased detriment of public basic services such as education, health, housing, urbanism, and environmental protection. Latin America and the Caribbean is the region from the Global South regions that has the highest weight, where the private debt has more weight, actually, with private creditors being about 70% of the total debt. This is relevant, addressing what Atia was saying before, that there's no conflict resolution mechanisms with the private creditors, and the actioning of the official bodies in this last decade is to increase the debt in our countries in order to pay the private debt. So then we end up having an exchange of creditors, but not an actual relief of the debt. And due to this mechanism, our countries are further subject to the mandates of the international bodies, particularly of the IMF, to orient their economies towards the repayment of the debt and not to the protection of the rights of the population. In this point, I want to state that it's not just about an external benefit from the region, but also a big part of the economical power in the region is leveraging these mechanisms by forcing structural and taxing reforms that end up allowing them to pay less taxes and at the same time keep their receivable of profits. And when the state refinances, they do loan with high interest. And this mechanism is absolutely unsustainable and is affecting the possibility of having dignified lives in our region. I believe it's relevant from the point of view of this whole landscape. And to wrap up in this first intervention and open this to dialogue, that Latin America and the Caribbean has forced or has been moving forward towards this kind of structural and taxing reforms, even when they're not even going through a crisis regarding that. I'm talking from Argentina. We are going through some of the most cruel processes in terms of taxing adjustments, where there's not just a record low in terms of allocation of entries sensitive to rights, but a public effect of the effect of these cuts that is affecting not just the senior citizens and females, but also, like is being debated in Congress today, the protection of disability population. And before before this situation, we could say that the countries in the region should try to move towards a more sustainable out that is more related to the human rights network internationally. However, the efforts have been weak. In the 80s, there was an attempt, a very constructive attempt to have a debtor club, which was a Cartagena consensus that actually produced a response from the creditors. I want to state that a few years back, there was a document that was revealed from the CIA that explained how this was a realistic threat to the United States, and they actually had to execute diplomatic actions to avoid it. In the current situation, these dialogues are even weaker, and this is an opportunity that might be lost, even though some countries in the region, such as Ecuador and Argentina, are the ones uh, entering into crisis um, debt crisis once and again. There are other countries such as Brazil and Costa Rica are also threatened by the debt situation and allocating to the payment of interest and the debt almost 6% of the GDP annually. In this sense, wrapping up again, I think that there's space for the countries in the region to move forward in the international dialogues for the constitution of conflict resolution mechanisms or crisis resolution mechanisms, but on the other side, for a converging the different regions such as Atia was saying. So also moving forward in the national legislation for aid to protect the formation of state will and the accountability of those that are affecting it by not managing correctly the debt towards the rights of the population. So that's kind of what I wanted to share. And I see that what I shared before was also shared in the chat. So thank you. I'm going to let you have the room back. Thank you, Francisco, for that presentation and for reflecting the context in the region. And one of the messages that I think it's important for those who have been working for years in this topic, and particularly for those who are new in it, the topic regarding what the impact of the debt is on human rights and what's the link between them, is that the conditions and conditionalities in the current context that we have with a high level of debt and also a high weight of the payment of the debt in our budgets generates that the governments, the states, do not have the ability and sometimes have to make decisions that actually limit that obligation of ensuring the human rights. That is an exercise in economic, social, cultural rights in the whole population, prioritizing women, youth, childhood. So they limit their ability to meet a series of commitments and agreements that are international and global, to which our countries should have the obligation to meet. So thank you again, Francisco. I want to remind you that you can, if you have any questions for our panelists, you can start leaving them in the chat box. We also have a space for a Q&A. As we develop the webinar, you can include those.
Now I would like to move on to our next panelist. I would like to invite Mi-Sun Wu she's the director of APWLD. She is connecting from the Philippines. And Mi-Sun, Asia is currently experiencing numerous armed conflicts and civil wars. Besides, you have in your region countries that are highly indebted, that have a history in terms of the high levels of debt and the impacts on human rights. What is your assessment in the current context and in the current global arenas and opportunities as well for these linkages between debt and human rights from an Asian perspective? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you for the invitation to co-organize this space together. And it's really a great pleasure to be part of this conversation. I'm actually calling from Sri Lanka, one of the countries that is really hit by the series of debt crisis. In short, the debt is a colonial tool enslaving people of the global South to ensure geopolitical power and economic domination of the global North. And overall, the current international financial architecture is, as we know, fundamentally incompatible with human rights, especially for the people in the global South. It is designed to and sustained by extracting labor and resources from the global South to channel wealth and power to the global North, the colonial powers. Colonialism continues. And unfortunately, the international human rights framework is not free from the political economy of power, and it suffers from the so-called ideology clashes. And hence, it is artificially divided into civil and political rights that deserves immediate realization, while, and the second set is, of course, economic, social, and cultural rights, which may be realized progressively subject to available resources as it kills people relatively slowly. It is no surprise or coincidence that there are repeated similar stories of human rights violations in the context of debt as the IMF and other international financial institutions act with a formula that cuts across regions and generations, which are aggressive privatization of social services and state-owned public sector enterprises, deregulation causing perpetual labor rights violations and environmental crisis, as Francisco mentioned, liberalization of trade and finance, and regressive taxation policies. The IMF and other creditors disguise its political motivation of neo-colonial domination, often in the name of economic advice or policy recommendations, which takes away the sovereignty of nations and peoples while taming the global south to be integrated into the so-called global value chain. In addition to extracting the global south wealth and resources through the debt architecture, it is critical to note where the global north countries actually are putting their finances. From the conversation that we have been having in Asia and the Pacific, as you mentioned, Patricia, we find it is in their military expenditure to fuel never-ending wars and conflicts, as it is a mechanism to generate profits, wealth, and power. Just a couple of days before the start of the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, as we know, the NATO member states committed to investing 5% of the GDP annually on core defense requirements, as well as defense and security-related spending by 2035. We know very sure that this target will be prioritized and most likely to be met, while the ODA commitment of 0.0% of GNI is somehow very difficult to meet, not to mention the debt reliefs. The global hegemony is also translated in the spending of developing countries, unfortunately, where we see frequent cases of higher military budgets than on health, education, or other social spendings. And of the case, military or defense budgets are not compromised in even countries facing that crisis, including Pakistan and Sri Lanka at present and ongoing, as well as South Korea in the past. Let me remind us the deep structural nexus between international financial architecture and militarism or war economy. The largest shareholders of the IMF and World Bank, the largest military spending countries, and top arms exporting countries are more or less the same. They are USA, Japan, Germany, UK, France, Italy, Canada, or the G7, China, Russia, India, and Spain. In 2024, global military expenditure reached over 2.7 trillion US dollars, while ODA from OECD DAC member states countries was merely 212.1 billion US dollars, while developing countries paid 921 billion US dollars in debt interest alone. Then the question arises whether this has been addressed in the outcome document of the FFD4. As Atia mentioned, the kindest answer is not really. For instance, even if there could be sufficient financial resources by redirecting military budgets to development finance, the outcome document does not mention militarism at all, though it mentions peace in a couple of paragraphs. Furthermore, if we look at the structure of the FFD discourse and the outcome document, it is very clear that it is designed to disconnect and not address the root causes of the development finance deficiency or inequalities between and within countries. Therefore, the statements or commitments under one area of actions contradict statements in other areas of actions and hence make the overall document obsolete. We might be positive to see some opportunities, but let me give you a couple of examples for our consideration today. While the Compromiso de Sevilla under the section on domestic public resources addresses corporate tax, including multinationals, the section on domestic and international private business and finance largely prioritizes investments, consequently shifting the focus to restructuring financial and capital markets of developing countries. More specifically, the paragraph 31 of the outcome document states, competitive investment opportunities are not always aligned with public goals. This underlines the need for policy frameworks and incentives for private investment at both national and global levels that promote sustainable development. More in detail, it commits to reducing the cost of doing business across borders and easing compliance burdens for private entities. So what does this mean? It means the two sections are largely in fundamental contradictions, as private investment always seeks and prioritizes profits over anything else. Similarly, while the outcome document only encourages the consideration of social protection and social spending in IMF-supported macroeconomic adjustment programs without deterring IMF's debt formula, including austerity and other neoliberal conditionalities, it highlights member states' commitment to putting the IMF at the center of the global financial safety net. This only confirms the complicity of all member states to the IMF's criminality when its compounding multi-generational adverse impact on human rights, dignity, and well-being of the planet are also very clear. So in conclusion, a real change in the debt architecture might start its first step only when the interconnected systems of oppression are talked about, including the linkages of debt, international finance, trade, and militarism, and how it joins hands with patriarchal fascism. That's when a minor disruption could start. But however, if this discourse continues to be disconnected and disjointed as it's currently framed, we don't have much hope in our policy advocacy, but to fully mobilize our movements for the change to happen on the streets and outside the so-called multilateralism. So with this, Patricia, I will give the floor back to you, and I would love to have more engagement and conversations.
Thank you so much, Misun, also for including the linkage with the private sector role in financing for development, also the role on trade, and how anyway all these topics are linked, are interconnected, and in a context of multiple crises, they reflect on an increase in debt with the high and urgent need to have a reform on the debt architecture. I would like now to invite our last but not least speaker, Memory Kachambwa. She is the director of FEMNET, and FEMNET has been actively participating in different processes where human rights, where women's rights should be in the top of the agenda. Not necessarily they do, but they should be, and you have been advocating for that. And also linking it with debt, but other financing for development sources. So what is your assessment, having heard all the panelists now? What would be your assessment and your perspectives from Africa? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And as FEMNET, we are also equally honored to be part of organizing this webinar. And I think it's coming at a timely moment where we've had time since Sevilla to sort of like step back and reflect on what came out. And I think it's apparent, I think all the other speakers before me have already mentioned the great disappointments that we face and how we didn't see much movement, particularly on issues around debt. So I'll speak a little bit, especially regarding, within the African continent. We know that Africa its reliance on debt is really, I think it's been mentioned that there wasn't recognition of why we are here, why our financial architecture, fiscal policies are designed in a way which still is an extractive agenda. So I think for me, I'd really like to start from that premise to say most of the countries on the African continent need substantial financial resources to support their development agenda, especially when there are challenges to their ability to generate revenue internally. And this has been a system where, coming from the colonial extractive system. So I feel like at FFD, there wasn't really mention or acknowledgement in terms of how do we, really get out of a decolonial mindset in terms of, that colonial legacy of extraction still is really, really still an issue for us. And it's really has perpetuated an equal relationship, which are really characterized by violent extraction, by militarism. I think Musun has actually mentioned it as well. And this has really relegated African economies to low value and therefore low revenue collection at a domestic level. And I think it was really worrying to see also how every other sort of like solution was being purported to be through private lending, the private sector. And I think for us, those are like red flags and really something to watch out for, because we do know what private lending has resulted in. We also know that Africa's debt has increased by 180% since 2010. So in 2022, for example, the debt reached about 1.8 trillion. And, when you really look at this, it really shows that the main burdensome issues around the debt is that it's really owed to international institutions rather than domestic lenders. And I think that becomes the way the debt burden is structured. So it makes refinancing to more difficult and complex. Additionally, the loans are also structured as short-term, high-interest investments, which are really not directed at development projects. And we've seen that I think a major issue is the issue of servicing of debts. I think about 10 African countries with data on creditors, they actually half of what they actually the ratio of debt to GDP is actually more. So more money is being spent towards debt servicing on the continent. And I think it was already mentioned that IMF and World Bank continue to even lend more money to countries at the expense of the needs and interests of people. So there is no human rights element which is there. And I think Prof. Atiya actually mentioned some of the opportunities like the Debtors Club, but I think we should be very careful in terms of, and also maybe really watch to say, when you talk of the Debtors Club, who is participating, even when you talk about some of the wake-out mechanism and having, creditors facilities, maybe like I know the African Union has been working on having such a mechanism. But I think we have to be very careful in terms of that not reproducing or not being an agent where it has just changed location, but has not systematically looked at some of the root causes that really makes us be in this predicament. So I think it's very also important to say, when you look at the cost of servicing debts, like I mentioned, most of it is disproportionately borne by women. When we see austerity measures and policies which have no regard for human rights, for women's rights in particular, for supporting the social structures, I think that becomes quite problematic. So I think I'll also maybe just speak to, I think, what was really coming out. I think just some of the key outcomes that were part of the FFD demands coming out from the Feminist Forum. I think the issue about having a binding, transparent, and rights-based legal framework through the establishment of the UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt. The second thing around canceling and restructuring sovereign debt in ways that can, center human dignity and justice and equity in the debt in the debt restructuring. I'm currently in Ghana, and Ghana, for example, has approached IMF 17 times, but without even if debt is cancelled and there's no restructuring with reforms, it still remains superficial and doesn't really address the deep structural inequalities and issues. But I don't think there should be any country forced to choose between repaying debt and fulfilling its human rights, including, of course, issues to do with health, education, sexual reproductive health and rights, or commitments on ecological justice as well. I think the third one was on revising debt sustainability analysis to go beyond narrow fiscal indicators and incorporate human rights, social protection, gender equality, as well as climate justice. The fourth on ensuring universal protection and eliminating austerity-driven responses to debt distress, and that dismantle public services and entrench poverty more, which really then disproportionate and is really harmful to communities, to women, and we've seen the impact of that. And I think the last one I have is on regulating the exploitative lending practices by mandating transparency in the debt contracts, the pricing model, and the risk assessments, and really abolishing some of the unjustified risk premiums. I think the discussion around risk really came out, and I think we need to look at it from a human rights perspective. So I think I would end and maybe just really maybe just emphasize that I think there's a huge component around false solutions within the climate space. So there's still fragmentation where we are also seeing false solutions coming in as debt as a response to the climate crisis. So I think for me to end is I think there's need for us to always ensure that we are also cognizant and also looking out for what is coming out in that space, because it is also being proper. Our countries will continue borrowing and increasing the risk, and as a solution to the climate crisis, when in fact it is a climate crisis. And I think it's very important for us to always ensure that we use our feminist lens in terms of looking at the debt crisis and really looking at some of the feminist economic alternatives which are rooted in care, injustice, and sustainability. Yeah, thank you so much, Patricia. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Memory, for including those very clear points on what would be the opportunities and challenges. And I think it's not only for Africa, it's really, it can be considered as a crossover for all southern regions, and to include the importance of have a feminist lens when we talk about that and human rights. So I would like to now, first, thanks to everyone for keeping the time and giving the space to have more conversation and more dialogue with the participants that are interested in this topic and that joined us today. So I would like to open the floor if there are any questions for the panel, so we can have a first round and we can actually have a dialogue and exchange. So I would like to invite all the participants that would like to make a brief comment, or do you have a specific question, to raise your hand.
If somebody wants to ask a question or make a comment, address the panelists so that we can have a dialogue, taking advantage of having our panelists actually meet the times that we gave them, which I'm very thankful for. So I'm going to let Rodolfo Mendoza take the word first, and then Fausto Santi. Thank you so much. Thank you for the excellent presentations and for clarifying the debt to us. I am absolutely in agreement with the analysis that you made, how the world is organized, the relationships between the North and the South, and the effects ultimately on the life of people, particularly on those who live in the global South. I think some of the propositions are good, such as the Debtor Club, but I think that the debt topic comes connected very much with the economic productive organization of the countries. If the global South was able to have a better economic development, social development, maybe the debt wouldn't be as bad. So don't we have the possibility of linking the demands regarding debt with changes or improvements in the productive structure so that way we can improve this issue? I don't know, I'm thinking about that, and it's a comment. Maybe might provoke an answer from the panelists. And again, thank you so much for your brilliant presentations. Thank you. Thank you, Rodolfo. And I'm going to ask you to please introduce yourself. So Rodolfo Mendoza is a member of Equidad Peru. Now I'm going to let Fausto have the word. Hello, good morning, everyone. These presentations were very interesting, and facing this, I have two questions that I'm gonna pose. There is a very strong issue in terms of the expenditure of the debt, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. We don't have an international body that audits, evaluates all of the processes that all of the countries do. The credit, that's the first question. If there's no like justice instance that determines due to the or this sentences due to the expenditure, the nonsensical expenditure of a country. The second the question, I would like you to explain the topic of the debt exchange for conservation, because here in Ecuador lately, there's this topic is happening. So they're exchanging debt for conservation and they're occupying the territory of the indigenous peoples. And in that, we're undergoing that issue right now. So that's what I wanted to ask about. Thank you, Fausto. And I have actually shared a link. We have several reports from Latin Debt regarding the debt exchanges. So I would like to take debt swaps. I would like to address this after the panelists answer those questions. So I would like to let Paddy Sianga take the word. Paddy.
Thank you so much. My name is Paddy Sianga Knudsen. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, super. I am the lead coordinator for the African Non-State Actors Platform on Migration and Development. And we were feel more than, I think it felt more like a privilege following on what Memory had just shared to have been at the Financing for Development Forum, because it was really overcrowded, if one could put the word, by private sector driven solutions. And I think that, you know, just echoing what Memory has shared, but also what other panelists have shared, really multilateralism has to rely on the voice of the people. And I felt that, you know, in a sense, even when you remember the demonstration that took place in the main lobby on that second day, and also from what we followed through the civil society network, in terms of civil society really being, in a way, being barricaded in bringing their messages more strongly, but having the business forum, for example, running side by side with some of the multilateral forum throughout the days gave you a sense of where, you know, member states have placed their heart. And hopefully they will not place their money, because civil society still remains active. So really grateful that this conversation is taking place here. I've put a comment in the chat in terms of how, from the platform where we bring together civil society, diaspora actors, and trade unions that work on migration and its nexus with development by looking at the option to stay. And looking at the option to stay for us means that we need to focus on development solutions that are driven by governments that really have an interest to see themselves in the driving seat in terms of how we allocate resources, but are listening to the voices of the people on how we utilize those resources. So all the way through the public finance management system, seeing how civil society, but the voices of the citizens are really listened to on resource allocation. And so I thought that it would also be interesting to give you a completely different perspective. And even when we add a feminist approach to this, we're seeing the importance of diaspora women, for example, women, female migrants as well, many who are leaving their homes and moving on to other spaces to work and sending remittances at home. And we've seen how remittances has overshot not just FDI. So here again, we see how the private sector really should have taken the second position if we're talking about financing, but also remittances that have exceeded ODA. And we see those falling down. And I was just recalling a conversation in a side event where I think it was the state minister from Denmark who was talking about the 0.7 club and the 0.7 club that seems to be dwindling in numbers in terms of some of the Global North partners in contributing to the ODA basket. And what this means is that we would need to look a little bit outside for this 0.7 club. And I'll end by saying my version of the 0.7 club is sometimes maybe not to look at the countries, but to look a little bit into the citizens and to look at citizens that have left home, but look at citizens that have also still an interest, and they show that through financial contributions that now are beginning to be taxed by countries such as the United States of America, which has placed a tax on remittances, which we really see, if I can paraphrase from what we've heard from others, as an attack on development financing that comes from the hands of the citizens themselves. So I thought that putting these in this context is also very important, that as we look at domestic revenue mobilization, as we look at other things around the UN Tax Convention, that we also highlight the role that remittances, but also diaspora contributions make in terms of them not just financing development, but also really having an equal footing on the table, as they are already more than equal footers on the financial side. I stop here. Thank you so much to the panelists for their esteemed presentations.
Thank you, Patty. And definitely this is a systemic, we need to have a systemic approach, and we need to have different key issues going on, different new global economic policies, changes and transformations at the same time. So thanks for linking it with other important issues as remittances and domestic resources mobilization. I'm sure our panelists will have a reaction on that as well. And now I would like to give the floor to Philemon Humbu y por último a Carlos Arana. Philemon, sorry, the floor is yours. Philemon Humbu? While we wait for, okay, your mic is open now. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Patricia, for giving this floor opportunity, and thanks to the panelists. Thank you, Memory. Yeah, like here in Zambia, about the human right, like high death rates, we are facing different challenges, like in the community level, especially in the community level, because I'm a chairperson. I work with the Zambia Men's Network, and I'm also a member in FMNet, because we are here to target how we're going to advocate for the young people so that we can use this impact. And we have some challenges where we are facing, like in university, like young people are being abused by the certain people, giving teenage pregnant, a high level here in Zambia. One of them, the most challenges about poverty level, but we are here to address this issue, to advocate for our fellow youth so they're able to hear what exactly they're supposed to do. And they were looking forward to build the capacity, like in Kampala, Uganda, with the one who opened a small orphanage, and here in Zambia, it's just about 3 or 5 young people, those who have interest, so that they're able to advocate for the young people to see how are we going to address the same issues and the challenges. And the most important thing is about we need to network and collaboration and to have the passion for it. And we need to work hard so that we reduce this insect, like in terms of human rights. Human rights are very important to us, especially as youth, young people, and we need to look forward so that we're able to address these issues. And most of the people here in Zambia, they don't know how about human rights. They're just abusing themselves. Young people, because we are the future leaders for today, not for tomorrow. So they are like young people, like they are loitering around in the street just because of poverty level. Sometimes it bugs me a lot when I found street kids sleeping in the lodge, begging because they just want them to give them just a small food. So I have a passion for that. I need to advocate for this issue. I'm trying to engage the government of Zambia, the public of Zambia, so that we see how we're going to work and to address this issue so that we're able to reduce the impact of us human rights. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Philemon.
I would like to let the last participant that has asked for the word in this round, Carlos Arana, go ahead. Hello? Can you hear me? Yes? Yes, we can hear you, Carlos. Thank you so much. Okay, I wanted to greet the panelists, also Patricia. So this jubilee year that I think is an opportunity also to deal with some issues regarding debt in countries such as ours in Peru, where there's a whole debate regarding whether or not the debt is an issue or not. We believe from civil society organizations believe that it is an issue. That is a problem for the country, particularly because we need lots of resources to pay for it and to allocate or to have a budget balance every year. So in that sense, I think it's important to see that those those are concerned very clear in the country, and I think that one of the proposals that we have been working on is to audit, right, or to propose audits that define clearly how much is it that we owe, because sometimes the government kind of covers accountability of some numbers, and if they're actually justified, that's indebtedness is actually justified and legitimate. So that's my opinion, and if any of the panelists can provide some light on what you think regarding citizen audits that maybe we could have in some of the countries. Thank you, Carlos. So with all of these comments, and in some cases also questions in the chat box, we have had some comments regarding audits of debt, again, debt swaps, and some participants mentioning that definitely, as Martha was saying, the way of the payment of the debt in the budgets is becoming higher and higher, and definitely the cost of the capital is higher for the countries in the south. And something that wasn't mentioned is that they also have an important role, the credit classification agencies in this role, when the financing costs according to the classification that our countries receive end up being elevated or high. And that is reflected in Africa, Latin America, and Asia quite clearly in the access to indebtedness from our countries. So I'm gonna let our panelists have the word so that they can comment, react, answer to the concerns that we just presented. They're pretty general. They're not really focused in one region or in one topic. So I'm going to leave it open so that you can answer. Answer the ones you feel close to or that you have a reaction you want to share. So I would do it in the same order. So Atia, you'll go first. Again, go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thank you for what have been really interesting comments and, of course, suggestions. So a couple of things that I think might be interesting for some of those who spoke. So I raised the issue of the taxation of remittances and the bill that was going to go through the US Congress while we were in Seville. And I noticed to my surprise that many member states were not even aware of it. If you look at my website, last year, I actually wrote a letter to all the member states of the UN General Assembly on the issue of remittances and the kind of value it places in developing country and the need we have to put into place a reduction of, for example, transactions costs, as well as any kind of transaction taxes. So this change by the US government is what is triggering also a lot of the decentralization of clearing points on SWIFT across developing countries. There's a connection between the two. So that's the one thing I want to point to. The second thing I think, which is quite important as well, is when it comes to any kind of swaps, including any debt agreements, one of the biggest challenges is the formula. And the reason I say the formula, and I want to cover both conversations in the same answer, is when a country takes on a debt, it's not necessarily a bad thing if you can assess how much economic growth the country will go through, how much it will be able to repay fairly, and still continue to develop. The challenge that many countries are facing is that the measure, the formula on how much should be repaid, how much the economy is growing, and therefore how much should be a fair repayment cycle is something that is not making a lot of sense, especially in post-COVID economies, which are not responding the same cycle of data and information as they were beforehand, and the economies are actually sluggish right now. And the same problem is facing debt to nature swaps, conservation swaps, because it's not clear on what the formula is and how much is being cancelled or forgiven or traded off. And what is the conservation or nature area and what is the value of it? And the reason I say that is because the case that is most celebrated, I think, is the one in Barbados, but I believe was only for one year's interest rate on the debt to conserve a marine area and was only for 1 year. So the exchange was only for the interest, not for the principal, and was only for 1 year. And then the following year, the interest rate kicked in again, but they still had to conserve the same area for posterity. There is no limit on how long you're conserving for. And this brings me to the challenge that is faced in these conversations around debt nature swaps, which is the same countries that are causing the pollution are the ones determining the formula. However, the problem in a situation like that is that the countries that are polluting continue to pollute. And if you want to measure what the proper formula should look like in that case, it should be that the same size piece of land in a developed country, if they were not having economic productivity on that land, what would they be losing economically? And if you compare, then you'll start to see that the figures don't make a lot of sense. So the problem is the challenges. The problem is a lack of transparency, without a doubt. And I'd like to also encourage you to have a look at my last year's report to the General Assembly, because I talk about a life cycle approach. And it's the same thing. It's the human being as they grow, and then the trade-offs. They lose food support in the schooling system, they lose free education. When you're born, you no longer get free vaccines. But at the same time, the country is put under a lot of pressure to pay off debts. But this same person, as they grow, is going to be the same person 15 years later who's going to be working and producing economic growth and paying taxes that are now supposed to be used to pay off the principal amount. So there's a trade-off on the interest rate while they're growing older and they're not receiving the support they need. And then there's a second trade-off when the principal is being paid off, where taxes are now increased. So it's got a lot to do with debt management as well. Thank you very much. Patricia.
Thank you, Atia, for your comments and also for clearly addressing the debt swaps. We are sharing many links in the chat box that I hope you can all access to have more information. And in the same way, I would like to take the opportunity to comment to all participants that compared to the co-organizers, we would like to ask you, and you're actually going to receive a link for a survey so that you can answer. In a moment, we're gonna send it also in other ways for those who are registered. If you feel it's interesting for us to generate a space for conversation uh, arising from this webinar, not just those who are participating, but actually to invite other organizations and other movements that consider important to go deeper on this dialogue regarding the link between that and human rights. So now I would like to invite Francisco Cantamuto so that he can share his comments. Go ahead. Thank you so much, Patricia, and thank you to all participants, and particularly those who proposed good reflections and questions. I don't know, Margot, can you hear me? Oh, Margot says there's no sound. I can hear you fine. Okay, okay. Um, so of course it's impossible to react to everything that was suggested. There's many motivating questions, but I do want to mention the importance that Philemon was proposing regarding the evaluation of the impact in terms of human rights for a vision that I believe was uh, memory was stating something about this, a wider vision of sustainability of life. In that sense, I think that regarding the formula that he was mentioning, it is necessary to put in the table not just the growth rate, but also other elements that make the meaning of human rights of the population in living in these countries. I believe that in this point, this is where what we talked about is valuable regarding the audits. Like I mentioned before, a big part of the debt, at least in Latin America, just to say it in a colloquial way, is lacking in papers. So it is interesting to see the ambiguity that the governments have and the economical power that over demand auditing on social policies, promoting policies where the poor need to show they're poor and that they deserve resources, but the creditors don't have to show any papers. What I'm saying, I apologize for the uh, the local view, but for example, when the payment to the Vulture Fund was approved in Argentina, they recognized debts where the only proof of that was a paper written by hand like this. This is the level of seriousness of some of the debts and the lack of respect. The auditing, in particularly the participatory auditing with the citizenship, is something that we need to bring to the table once and again, and it's a mechanism of basically asking for them to respect the state of right, state of order. Of course, we do not have a court to solve this, but we need to build in the sense of improving the mechanisms of control and specifically citizen control over the debt and push for the recognition of the co-accountability of the creditors in operations that were detrimental to human rights. And this also is valid for the debt swaps that Atia already spoke about and create a full. These swaps are faulty due to the lack of transparency and participatory mechanisms. And this has to do with the action on a specific fact, nature, education, or whatever, and not so much debt relief. The debt swaps don't really relieve the debt. They're not a realistic way out through the indebtedness. We need to emphasize this. So many times there's a pressure of a country to show commitment with the SDGs or millennial goals, and it doesn't really do, and they're not really doing anything, but they make the debtor state carry out these actions. And about the second thing, the creditor countries need to recognize the environmental debt they have with our countries. That's a demand that we need to bring to the table. Last comment to wrap up, not because I'm answering everything, but just not to take too much time. Rodolfo was talking about the productive structure, and I want to emphasize what was said before, not just by me, but was also stated, Isona Memory mentioned it, that how the creditor pressure pushes changes in the taxing or fiscal structure, activities that do not pay taxes and others that do. For example, the IMF is still suggesting to elevate the uh, tax of the added value tax, which is very unfair, and also to de-tax some exports, for example, fuels, against an environmental transition. This is an example. The fund has estimated that due to fiscal abuse, a region loses 3.6% of the GDP each year. That would be enough to pay almost all of the debts if the economical power sectors paid their taxes. Then the rest should not see their rights threatened. And alongside this biased fiscal system, we have the reforms that are connected to what kind of productions are enabled or not. And here we have the promotion to uncontrolled extractivism that in a region is provoking an actual social environmental disaster. So the productive model is biased by the interest of the creditors that, as Misun mentioned, they're not just financial creditors, but these are actors that are meshed with having business through production and trade. So thank you for the space again, and I'm available to continue discussing. Thank you so much, Francisco Misun.
Yeah, thank you so much. A few comments. First on Patty, thank you for bringing up the diaspora investment that conversation. Actually, one of our members from the migrants movements were with us at the FFD4, and she's been following the different side events that was very much talked about remittances and diaspora investment, at which we monitor with a deep concern because as in I can imagine in other regions, including Africa and Latin America, in Asia, the labor migration, it remains as the final option for the communities and countries who have gone through the financial crisis, the debt crisis, and the complete destruction of the national economies, right? And then it is very concerning to have the diaspora investment as the private sector or private, the private capital mobilization plan, because it is again hitting the migrants who are only left to migrate to sustain their livelihood or support their family, to again be trapped into supporting whatever economies or debt burden at the cost of their labor, at the cost of their life and livelihood. And again, shifting the obligations or human rights obligations of the state to individuals and migrant workers who are most likely coming from the bottom of the social structure anyway, right? So we continue to monitor that conversation with quite a serious concern, and it would be really good to get more connected with how you analyze and understand the trends of the conversation going, and actually how the effective management of the remittances are actually further stripping people from their human rights and dignity. The second point on multilateralism, the civil actions on day 2 actually was an insult, really an insult, giving us 30-minute space while there were censorship on what messages we can bring. And we are even told that we cannot mention women's human rights in our messaging, right? So that's the state of how UN behaves, with having member states, the colonial masters as their bosses and private sectors as their another bosses. And I think the active use of word multi-stakeholderism is further capitalizing and privatizing the UN, because it delegates the civil society from the right holders to a stakeholder, right? So I think we have to be very active, not using multi-stakeholderism, because that is really to create the space and give power to the private sectors and businesses to actually come to the decision-making table at the cost of removing civil society and movements in the space as in the UN. The next point that I want to mention is actually the point that Jean brought up in the comments on private or household debt. At least in Asia and the Pacific, the private or household debt is actually the consequence of a fundamental restructuring of the nation's political, economic, and social policies to meet IMF conditionalities, as well as to secure credibility for foreign investments. How does that happen is because then the states are no longer capable of fulfilling their human rights obligations because they have to make a structural adjustments to meet the conditionalities and pay the debt, while then the responsibility of sustaining one's life and livelihood is shifted to as an individual responsibility. And that's why I think some of the countries in our region, the private and household debt is higher or larger than the GDP. But again, I want to bring back to how the structures are interconnected. That cannot be looked at from an isolated point of debt, because it really has to come in as from a trade perspective. And one example is how actually farmers are pushed to have farm loans to have access to pesticides, access to seeds, and access to fertilizers, because of the agreement on agriculture is not allowing or even criminalizing farmers when they exchange seeds or keep their traditional seeds through the patents, right? Then the farmers are pushed to have more microcredit and private and household debt, which they are not able to pay back because of the high interest rate and different kind of ID confiscation, and that further leads to the suicide of the farmers, right? So again, the structures are so interconnected, and if we are going to talk about debt and human rights, it has to have a comprehensive and cohesive approaches. Lastly, maybe it is linked to the audit or maybe not. Maybe one thing that we think positively is about the document, this outcome document, talking about the oversight by national parliaments and public debt management system. And maybe only if there is a strong civil society engagements, then maybe strengthening the national parliament's oversight to debt management could be actually a positive point that come up from the FFD4 discourse.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sun. And now I would like to give the floor to Memory.
Thank you so much. I think most has. Sorry. Yeah, sorry for that. I think most of the responses have come out. But I think it's I think one of the things that I'm really getting out is there was also the issues around blended finance. I think there's certain terms and terminologies which are coming in. I think one of our push was to reform the global financial architecture. And I felt like during Sevier, we went with so much high spirits, but I felt such a betrayal, because of the whole, the whole compromise which was before. And I feel like that didn't really come out to say what exactly within the global fight. I just feel that was not really taken on board to say what have we changed, how do we move forward in terms of changing. But I think there's a bit of hope. Looking from the UN Convention on the Tax Convention, maybe for us to learn within the debt space how they maneuvered and managed to get a framework even outside a formal process like FFD going forward, and how we can also maybe work with our negotiators coming from, particularly from the global South and majority, to really come together in this whole multilateral space as we see the shrink in the multilateral space. I think the also shrinkage in civic space is also worrisome in terms of how budgets are shifting towards the security budget, less transparency, and I think we need to work more in solidarity from the global south, because I think that is what can propel us to continuously come together. I think for me, I think those are the key points. I think most of the points have already been responded to. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you to our panelists. We have shared several links regarding debt swaps. I would just like to add that those who are interested in the topic review the current debt financial architecture swaps is very different for the one we had 20 years ago. So it's important to understand what the architecture is currently and why we have these concerns and these risks. Also, I would like to highlight that there is a common point in our comments regarding what the opportunities and challenges are that we have towards the processes of implementation of the civil commitment and the FFD4. And from civil society, we try to advocate and influence the process towards the approval of a framework convention on sovereign debt in the UN. And that would be a way in which we would change the current situation of power of asymmetries in the debt policies, and it would lead to a reform of the debt architecture. And even though we haven't been able to reach this framework convention itself, we have approved the carrying out of an intergovernmental process to issue recommendations regarding the debt architecture reform. So therefore, that is one of the main opportunities that we can see to change the governance in the debt architecture, which is a topic that was also talked about in this webinar. What is the current governance? Who has the power? Who's making the decisions? Talking about human rights and the debt and all of the comments that we have been reading and listening to, it allows us to put a face to the impact of the debt on human rights. And I just want to wrap up by thanking our panelists. I want to also thank the co-organization by Special Rapporteur of the UN Commission on Human Rights.
The Special Rapporteur on the UN Commission on Human Rights. Thank you, Atia. To the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development. Thank you, Misun. And to the African Women's Development and Communications Network, FEMNET. Thank you, Memory. And also to the House of Fiscal Wisdom that is led by Atia. And we expect to hear more from them in the future. And
I would also like to thank Francisco Cantamutu, who drafted this report for Latindad, and I hope it's useful, not just in the region, but also for other regions. And lastly, wrap up by saying that everything is connected. Solving the issue regarding the debt is not gonna allow the full exercise of human rights. It's a whole system, it's a puzzle with different parts. And we have heard about a fiscal system, evasion, illusion, and the official aid for development, trade. Therefore, is a systemic view in which we need to have reforms and changes in parallel so that it can be sustainable in the mid and long term. Lastly, to remind you that we have sent a link to a survey, not just a satisfaction survey, but also we would like from the co-organizers to have a perception as to whether or not you would like to have a group with those who were registered today and invite other organizations to have a better exchange and dialogue regarding data and human rights from the different regions of the global south, but also towards different spaces of opportunity in which we can get together and exchange and create joint strategies. So thank you so much. It was a very enriching dialogue. There's so much more to talk about. There's many topics. It is not simple. Thank you for participating and bringing back to the agenda this topic that is so important for our populations, our peoples, and to promote human rights in all of our countries. Thank you. Have a great rest of the day.
Gracias.